Welcome back, everyone. I hate to start before everyone's back, but we do record the session so people can go back and watch what they missed. This session, we're going to hear from Craig Thorburn. You met Craig in the week 3 modules. He joins us from Washington, D.C., originally from Australia. Craig?
Yes, thanks, Jeff, and hello to everybody. Welcome back. In this session now, we're just going to go through some of these different concepts of developing your regulatory and supervisory framework, and with a little bit of a sort of focus on some of the areas which are perhaps most relevant in terms of like actuarial thinking, and so that might hopefully then also work well with what else you're doing regarding the program. So let me just start with a little bit of a focus on what we're planning to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about the sort of structure of regulation and supervision. You've had some material about this before. We're just going to recap something that I presented in the online sessions, so that that was, I think, part of the program in week 2, if I have that right. So it could be a little while ago for some of you that you saw that, and so that I just to touch on that and see if anyone has questions or observations or something that wasn't so clear. We'll look at how the regulatory regime evolves typically, and I think the point of that will be to say where would you fit in that, and how would you move along, and that will help you to say, well, look, this is what we expect to be, not, we'd like to go from here to the very end of the road, but what are the steps along the way that that we should think about. And that will then lead into the discussion we're going to then follow. Janice is going to chip in on what we've seen so far on the action planning and help you to just be fully ready for completing that part of the program. Okay, so this is one of the diagrams that fits in with supervisory structures a lot, and it actually typically comes from the Basel framework, and I think people will be somewhat familiar with this, which looks at this idea that we're trying to look at a series of different sorts of risks, and you've talked quite a lot about the different kinds of risks that that might be part of the focus. And then crossing all of those risks, we have a sort of series of pillars of activity, and this is where this kind of 3-pillar approach or Basel approach excuse me, comes from. And so the first pillar is really the quantitative requirements that you might have kind of written down in your rules. So these are things like your actual capital requirement, which is a quantitative requirement. But there'll be other quantitative requirements as well. You can't have a certain amount more of, say, investment elements, or it might be to do with reinsurance requirements, but anything that essentially has a quantitative number with it. So these are sort of, in one sense, fairly hard and fast rules. Then there's the second pillar, which people would describe as qualitative requirements, and that's things like good corporate governance, risk management, things that might have to be done that are not so quantitative, but more about how things work well. Fit and proper requirements would be another example of that. And then pillar 3 is the whole concept of disclosure and market discipline. And the idea of that is to say, well, if we have something that's disclosed by the insurance company or the regulated entity, because it applies, of course, generally, and the market looks at that and says, we like this better than that, then the company is more likely to get rewarded or penalised as a result. And you can have that sort of market discipline acting as a brake on bad behavior by company managers. So that's one sort of approach to this 3-pillar concept. Sometimes you do see it a little bit differently described. So pillar 1 is kind of the regulation, pillar 2, the supervision activity, and pillar 3, the market disclosure. And so if you've got that as a different approach, you'll then say, conceptually, pillar 1 is all of our rules. Pillar 2 is the fact that we supervise our rules. And I think that's very relevant in most of the countries where that are participating, and in fact in most countries, because if you think about it, the market discipline approach relies on people that can receive this information and will make decisions that have a commercial consequence for managers, like I described. And so it's unlikely that markets with less financial literacy will be able to do that. And it's also unlikely if, for example, you have a lot of companies that are actually subsidiaries of foreign companies, their market disclosure is taking place in the foreign country rather than locally. So that then means perhaps the weight of the pillars that you're pursuing is going to be a little bit different, and you might pursue more attention on pillar 2, the supervisory activity. Now, that's a good concept to have in mind, because if anyone ever asks you why we do supervision and why we don't just leave it to the market, then this 3-pillar concept is the justification for that, particularly because that 3rd pillar is likely to be less effective. Let's just move to the next slide. This is the slide that was the basis of the presentation I gave on the remote process, and it talks about how capital rules in particular are part of a continuum, not just different things floating around in space, but part of a continuum from the very, very straightforward, simple, not very risk sensitive end through to the really sophisticated, complicated technical end, from flat minimum amounts to a formula that's a greater of something or another, to a formula that's got lots of factors that you then add together to get the result, to a combinatorial approach, which usually has this square root sign, and then ultimately to the use of models. So I'm going to ask a polling question and just see whether people can give us an idea about where their existing capital rule applies out of these different categories: the flat minimum, the greater of index, the additive index, the combinatorial approach with the square root, or the internal models. So perhaps we can get that first polling question up, and I'm going to ask it, like, first of all, for non-life insurance, because I know some jurisdictions have different approaches for life and non-life. So for non-life insurance, which one of these categories would you say your approach is? We have one very quick answer straight away. Now we have 2, 3. Getting a few more. Now, of course, not everybody necessarily is going to be totally familiar with their situation, so just wait for a couple more. So we can see that we have nobody reporting the flat minimum approach. We have 4 at the greater of, 2 additive, and 5 combinatorial, and then nobody on the sort of the other extreme. Okay, let's go to the next question, which is the same one, but for life insurance. So, Rachel, if you can jump to that one. Here we go. Rachel's very well prepared, right off the we would say right off the gun there. So the same options in the same order, but for life insurance. And as I predicted, we do have some different answers here. Let's just wait for a couple more. Okay, that's good. That's really useful. So you can see that we've got some differences for a start between life and non-life. And one of the interesting things about this is that you are not the first group to do this. It's actually been something that was done in each of these programs in the past, and the Access to Insurance Initiative are collating a nice report on all of these so you can see the examples. But you'll see there's a range of views, and you'll also see that there is this emerging sort of combinatorial, reasonable number of combinatorial cases, but then quite a lot of simpler, more straightforward cases. So regarding that, let's ask the third poll question, which I think is also important to just interpret this. And that's to say, you know, if that's your system, that's one thing. Are you thinking about changing your system? So you might say, yes, we are, especially if it's a project that you're doing right now. You might say, no, not really. Or you might say, you don't know, or you're not sure. We're seeing some early answers to this one. Couple more. So far, we have it somewhere, but oh, we're getting more and more changes. Well, that's good news for people that are involved in these kinds of activities, and probably for this course, and maybe even for the next couple of slides, Jeff, I think is probably a real bonus. So you can see there we have, look, yes, 10 out of the 12 responses are looking to change. So what does that tell me? One thing it tells me is that when we look at the systems you currently have, not everyone is saying that's where we're going to stay. This is the situation as we know it. Some of those systems exist and have existed for a very long time and are overdue for updating. And that's what you're looking to do. So I think that's great. It is good to know that there are different approaches that exist around the world, from the simplest to the more complicated. But I think what we're seeing is that people are moving along this spectrum. Does anyone have a question or a comment about this spectrum, or something that they're unsure about? They'd like clarification. You can either type it into the chat, or you can turn on your microphone and ask, put your hand up, something like that. All totally clear? Okay. So let's keep moving then. So this is about change, really, this slide, which I think is important, that people are moving from this one level to the next. And some of the things that drive that movement are that the insurance industry becomes more sophisticated. And so it means that you want to have a more granular approach. Another one could be that you're moving to a more risk-based approach, so you want to understand those risks better from a supervisory point of view. A third possibility is that the insurance industry's technical capacity is growing, and so their ability to do some of these things is improving. These are all elements. So if you want to say, well, this is where we currently are and this is where we'd like to go, you could consider those sorts of criteria. How is it working for how sophisticated our market is? How is it working for technical capacity? How is it supporting our risk-based approach? So you can count more or less up and down the scale on numbers of actuaries, for example, and things like that as to where people are going to be on this spectrum. We have a question, which I think is a good question. Are there any jurisdictions based only on internal models? This is kind of like the sort of utopian end of the scale to say, where would we go and find a jurisdiction where they don't have anything except internal models? And the truth is, most jurisdictions, even if they have an internal model component, will only allow it for perhaps the more sophisticated companies or the particular kinds of risks that are capable of being modelled and elaborated in this way, and also because they need to have the internal resources to validate and inspect and approve these models. So it's quite a lot of work. And so if you have a situation where you only had internal models, even the smallest, least sophisticated company in your market would have to be using it. And that's usually not practical or even proportionate for that matter. So jurisdictions that have internal models usually have that as an option over and above the sort of a more standard combinatorial approach. And there's quite a few of those jurisdictions, and some of them, the experience has been that nobody took up the option to have an internal model. So it was available under the supervisory structure and the rules, but the companies, when they looked into it, they thought, well, this is a lot of work and we're not going to get a whole lot of benefit from that. We have a model internally that we use for management purposes, but upgrading it to the point where it would be good enough for supervisory approval is a different story altogether. Now, the IAIS standards actually have quite a lot of requirements on how you would go about doing that approval. So it's not a trivial step. There was one country that did have an internal model-based approach, and that was Switzerland. And as you can imagine, Switzerland is a fairly sophisticated place. You know, they make all those watches for a start. That is a long-standing thing that they do, and they have big reinsurance companies and lots of data and companies that they are fairly long-standing, close supervisory relationships with. So it was practical for them to do that. Since more recently, they have introduced a standard option, let's say. So they started with the internal model approach and added the standard option as a sort of fallback. But pretty much everyone else has gone to the standard approach with the option of the internal model after that. So that's a good question. There has been a case where that's been the situation, but you wouldn't expect it of most markets. Okay. Thanks very much for that question. Very, very useful. So we've seen lots of people are interested in making a change. The next slide I thought might be useful, and if your action plan is about this, it's going to be very useful, is how might you go about making that change? And let's have a look and see how you would go through that process. We've done a lot of these, and So I thought it was helpful to say, well, look, what steps would we go through and how would we go about it in a way that we've also seen other countries do. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something where it's external. But when you're updating, which I think is the next question we've just had there, when you're updating from one approach to the next, one of the things that you need when you go down that step is a lot of technical capacity during the period of the project. Now, once you come out the other end is one thing, and beforehand is one thing, but during it, there's a lot of extra work to be done at a technical level. So sometimes we get involved with countries to do that at the World Bank. And the first thing we do is we call it a market review. So we prepare a document that says, here's the situation in the market, focusing on the relevant kinds of things that insurance companies do that are important for risk and solvency and capital, and what kind of practices they have, and potentially how the current rule responds to those practices. And that basically serves a couple of purposes. The first step really is to say, is there a case for doing something? Because when you go out and say to the industry, look, we think we need to upgrade our capital requirement, they're not sitting there thinking, yes, isn't it great to have risk-based supervision? Or isn't it great to be improving our capital rule to better comply with the IAIS standards or anything like that? The first thing they're thinking of is, you want to increase my capital, that's going to cost me money, and I don't want to do that. So the first step really is to make the case as to why this is a good idea to explore. So that's really what comes out of this market review. And we've seen different countries do this as well themselves. One of the things that it also does, if you have a consultant, is it means that the credibility of the consultant understanding the local market is established by this step. So you don't get the situation down the road where someone says, oh, this person came from this other country, what do they know about us? They don't really understand our situation. But it gets everybody agreed that there are issues that need attention. There are opportunities for improvement, and so let's go forward. The second step is to say, well, we would call it a qualitative step. We have to establish, before we can jump right in and say, here's a proposed new formula, we have to establish, exactly what do we want to do? So we say, well, do we want to go one or two steps along this road? Do we want to jump to the combinatorial approach all at once? Or do we just want to make some gradual steps of improvement in that direction? Which particular areas do we want to focus on? In other words, what kind of formula are we going to end up with? Not with any parameters, just with the sort of general shape of the formula. Because a lot of people could respond to that consultation and say, oh, that's too complicated. Or I think we should do more about this. Or we really need to focus our attention in this area. So you get good feedback. And until you agree on what the formula is going to be, you can't start setting the parameters because you don't know. Now, the other useful thing to do at this stage is to indicate what kind of approach you're going to use for the setting of the parameters. In other words, what kind of level of security do we think is appropriate? And so, because each of the more recent capital rules comes with a level of security that's kind of defined, and the IAIS, in fact, suggests that you need to have that to meet with their core principle requirements. But it's usually not that helpful, I find, to talk to people about a 90-something% over 1 year point at this stage, because almost everybody will tell you that's too high. We don't want to increase our capital. So it's better to talk about things in a sort of qualitative way. And one useful element of that is to look at the concept of whether things should be sort of, let's call it investment grade, or whether they shouldn't be investment grade, and try and get people to say, well, yes, the promises we make should be investment grade. And in fact, the opposite of investment grade in investment terms is junk status. So not too many members of the insurance industry want to go public and say we want to make junk status promises to our customers. So you tend to get a reasonable amount of consensus on that, and then it's a matter of translating that into an actual number. But it's always good to ask people's opinion at that point, because once you have that, then you have the formula that, and you have the level of security, then we can start thinking about what the parameters might be. So that's that second step. Then the third step is to say, okay, we agreed the shape of the formula, we agreed the level of the security that we're looking for. Let's go to the third step of saying, well, so what would the parameters be? So here's our at best sort of go at the parameters, but we also want to test that. And almost always when you do a capital requirement reform, you then need to have some sort of quantitative assessment or impact assessment. Sometimes it's called a QIS, sometimes it's called a road test. Well, it doesn't really matter what it's going to be. You have to get people to sort of have a go at filling in the form, because at the end of the reform process, when you have the new rule, it's not much use if people can't manage to actually do the calculations and send in reasonable quality results. And I can assure you the first time they try and do it, it won't be very pretty in terms of neat and accurate and nice. So it's a good idea to at least have it as a sort of a couple of practice runs in effect. Some jurisdictions actually have these parallel runs for quite a period of time. Others do a sort of a road test just to at least find out what the impact is going to be on the companies. Then you can make some adjustments if the impact's too much, and you can also answer the question of what sort of transitional arrangements might we need. And we can talk about those a little bit for people that are interested. But the point of this diagram, where I've got the two circles effectively going around, is you might need to do more than one road test, or you might get lucky and just do one. Once you get to the end of that process, you've effectively said, here's what we want for the formula, here are the parameters, this is how the transition is going to work. We've thought about all these things, we've made these decisions to come to a conclusion. That alone is not the end of the story. And that's because you actually need a rule to then adopt. And if you look at everyone else's capital rules, it's not full of background discussion about why we should do this instead of that and how we came up with this decision and all that. It's just a straightforward explanation of the situation. So although we've made all the decisions at this point, we have to translate it into the actual regulatory instrument. Now, I've seen a lot of cases where people have tried to jump straight to this as the process. You know, we were going to do a reform of our capital requirement. We've drafted a new rule. Here it is. Tell us what you think. Invariably, that isn't going to work, because all these in-between steps, which help to build consensus and understanding in the industry, haven't been proceeded through. So that's a good example of that reform process, and it just illustrates that it's not a short trip. It takes a little while. Now, if your project happens to be capital, if this is for your action plan, then you might like to just reflect on some of these steps along the way as to see what you're doing in your action steps. And then if your project is about something else, you might also like to give some thought to just how much we have to go through a series of steps to make sure we bring along our stakeholders. And how long that might take. Any questions about that or comments?
There's one question from Abdesatar in the chat, Craig, about moving from basic ratio to RBS combination of factors and what the main challenge is. I think you've probably answered that question. Came before you moved to this slide, I think so.
Yes, so I think this has talked a little bit about those challenges. I mean, it is possible. Let me just go back again a couple of slides, and I'll use my little laser pointer thing here. So the question is really, can we go from here or perhaps here and jump up to here? And I think the answer to that is it is possible. Now, if you are up to get up here at this level, then what we need is a certain level of skills and technical data and people in insurance companies with those kinds of skills to carry out that kind of ongoing work. And if you have that, then it is quite possible to say, look, we had this old system, now we want to move to this new system. This is exactly what they did, in fact, in Europe, when they moved from Solvency I, which is the greater of approach, to Solvency II, which is largely combinatorial type approach. But it took them a long time. It took them a long time to start, so their starting point was a long way out of date on everybody's practice by the time they were even started moving. And then they took a long time to get it finalized because there's a lot of countries involved and everybody had opinions and there's so many companies and the whole thing. They had a lot of times they went around that QIS exercise. In most countries where you don't have that, it's still possible to say, look, we will jump up to here. But the reason we'll do that is because our previous method was a long way out of date and we have the technical capacity to get there. But you might still find that you have a lot more, just a couple of extra loops around here, because the companies may not all be able to do that quantitative work. They might need a bit more practice. So that's an example. Now, we did actually, one country where they did do this as well, outside of the EU, as an example, is Sri Lanka. And one of the things that the Sri Lankans did, particularly with their life insurance regime, going from one extreme, sort of one level to quite a higher level, is they had a quite long parallel period to give the companies the chance to be doing the calculations, submitting them, doing them again, submitting them. So I think they went over 2 years with regular reports using both systems sort of beside each other before the old system fell away. And that actually is of itself is quite an interesting concept we'll come to in a couple of slides. Okay. This next slide is also one that is kind of, I think, interesting for people, because it doesn't look just at the capital one, but at the whole concept of moving in a risk-based world, saying that where we start, we tend to have fairly strong supervisory activity and intervention and control, and where we end up, we tend to have control moving much more to the company. So at the beginning of a risk-based step, you're checking what the company does, and at the end of the risk-based step, you're checking the results of that and the people doing it. So you're not sort of devoting so much time to looking at files, and you're devoting much more time to looking at people. That's how I would describe that. So you end up saying, well, instead of having more quantitative rules for reinsurance and other things, we start to say we want to have policies and statements that are effective and are working well and are well managed. So you'll see that as well as you compare what you might be doing with other jurisdictions, is that some people will have quite detailed requirements. Some people will just say we need to have detailed policies at the company level that will be reviewed. So that's another possibility as you move down the road, is that you move from requiring a long list of specific things that are perhaps bullet pointed to a broader requirement for adequate policies and procedures within companies. Now, that then means that it's a bit like growing tomatoes. And not everyone has grown tomatoes. So I've got a picture of a tomato plant right here. I know that in some countries tomatoes don't grow at all. In other countries they have to have different varieties. But you can see this particular tomato plant looks pretty typical. It has some tomatoes on it and the plant is tied to a stake. And what I mean by that is, in a rules-based world, the stake is the rules, equivalent to the rules. So if I'm managing an insurance company and I want to know what to do, I can pick up the regulation that says you must do these 5 things, and I do those 5 things and I feel better. And when the supervisory people come and ask me how I'm going, they ask me whether I did those 5 things and I say yes, and I show them the evidence of that, and they feel better and tick off that I have complied. This is a compliance-based approach. And that's fine. Now, when I move to the risk-based approach, then it's not as though we can just pull the stake out straight away and throw it away, because what would happen is the tomato plant would fall down because the stem of the tomato plant is not strong enough to hold up those tomatoes. It relied on the stake. And that's the same with insurance companies. They may understand what you mean about having good risk management and doing things properly, and they might have an actuary who's capable of doing lots of great things, but they may not have invested in systems and procedures and gathering data and all those sorts of things, because there's no point. While the rule says this is what you have to do, then if I do something else exotic on the side, you know, no one's going to give me any kind of reward for that. All it is just going to be an extra expense. So it's going to take time for the companies to build up those kinds of sets of data and information and technical procedures, and maybe some understanding of in their own mind, and maybe actually getting the right people. So it has to be, it's an exercise where you would gradually remove the stake to allow the plant to strengthen. In the same way, moving to a risk-based approach, it's not a matter of just going from day 1, we're in a rules-based approach. Day 2, we're going to go risk-based. Everything will be fine. If you do that, you'll find almost everybody has got questions about what on earth are we meant to be doing. And I'm sure some of you have had that experience. Equally, in the supervisory agency, in a risk-based world, we have to start doing things like looking at the quality of the people and how well that's working and things like that. So if you had people who were really good in the rules-based world, and they would go and do inspections and they'd look at company files and make sure that everything was in line with the regulations, that's a pretty straightforward decision to make. Either that it is or it isn't, yes, no, check off the list, report the ones that are problematic. Now, if on that, so they spend their time in the file room checking the files. Now, if you say to them, now we're going to, I want you to tell me if you think the chief executive officer is competent. That's a much more difficult thing. First of all, the chief executive officer is probably an opinionated person who's got to his position, or her position, I suppose, with by arguing strongly with other people over their career. Most of them think that they're very capable of doing just about everything, and they don't really feel that interested about having relatively junior supervisors asking their opinion about things. So that can be a sort of difficult thing. Plus, in truth, they should know more about running insurance companies than supervisors do. Otherwise, supervisors would be running insurance companies. So one thing they don't know about is supervision, but they probably think they do as well. But it's a difficult skill set to develop to be able to do that. So internally, we have to develop our staff who are doing those sorts of things. And we might also need some infrastructure, for example, because we're not going to be doing everything with everybody. We're going to respond to the higher risk companies with more activity and the lower risk companies with less activity. So we need to have a rating system of who's high risk and who's low risk. And if we don't have that, then it's going to be more difficult to have risk sensitive intervention. And the other thing that we often need to develop is an actual sort of internal ladder of intervention. So we say, well, as the company goes through these risk levels, this is the thing that we'll be doing more and more of. So I thought maybe I'd ask a poll just to see where people are in terms of this step. Let's pick, for example, the question of the rating system. And I've got a few answers here that you can choose from. Let's have a quick look here. Whether you have a rating system which produces a risk rating for each insurance company. And some people could say, yes, we do. Some people could say, no, we don't. I've given you another option to say, yes, we do, but we'd like it to be a bit better. And then the other option, well, that's probably someone else's area of work. I don't know what we have. So let's see who's got what here. And probably we can expect more than one response. Four so far, there must be a few more. Okay, well, so the general appearance of the answers we're getting is that most people participating in this course, they don't have a rating system that does this rating internally. So that alone says to us, well, it's going to be a little bit difficult to then intervene based on high, medium and low risk. I suppose it was really helpful seeing Janice's presentation earlier on about how we were able to make those judgments from the different information that she had. And she talked a lot about how key performance indicators can be useful. And one of those, of course, is the solvency coverage ratio. And if you've got a solvency measure that's more reflects the risk, then that's going to be a tool that's better for this kind of exercise. But if you don't have it, then that's an important step to be taking, to be able to then prioritise your risk-based supervisory approach, and it's quite an ongoing exercise. So we can see that there are some people there that say that yes, we do have one, and we'd like to improve it. And I think pretty much everybody goes through that from time to time. So that's pretty normal. It's a little bit like we saw with the capital requirement, that it can become a progress to a more and more complex one that reflects risk in a more granular way. Equally, your risk-based rating system can also be something where it's an ongoing process of improvement and implementation. I see from Nathaniel there, we want to implement a risk map for our market. Yes, so it is I think it's a very good tool if you're going to be doing risk-based supervision, that you need to be able to say, well, what are the areas of risk that we're most interested in right now, and therefore what should we be doing? Now the argument in favour of risk-based supervision, at least one of them, is not only you're going to end up with more focused supervision on the things that matter, but you're going to do less of things that don't matter. And this is also a bit difficult when you first start out on this road, is that people have to accept that we're not going to go out and check everything anymore. We're going to concentrate our resources on the things that we've identified are priorities right now. And because everybody wants you to do that, but then they don't want you to stop doing anything. But the argument in favour is to say, well, look, this is where we're going to go and we will be focusing on these things. And this is where that exercise on the previous slide, where we rely more on certain people, becomes important. Because, for example, you may say, look, we're going to increase our interest in particular areas, and instead of checking compliance on other things, we're going to ask that to be included as part of the work that the external auditor's doing, or something like that. So, so there's an example there. Now we'll just jump onto the next slide, which happens to be the last one. And I've got a series of questions here, and I thought maybe one way around this would be to see if you could make some suggested answers. And given the time, Jeff, I might just pick on a couple. Let's see what people have to say in the chat to some answers, or if you want to open your microphone and give us your opinion on point number 2. Now, number 2 says, imagine a situation where an actuary makes a recommendation in an actuarial report. What would you normally think you would do as a supervisor? Now, I think this is pertinent because it came up a few times when we did this course in the past. And, you know, we're trying to say, well, what kind of actuarial things would we want to focus on? And I'm sure a lot of you might think, well, we get an actuarial report. What am I meant to do with this? Anyone got any ideas what you would do when you read a report and there's a recommendation? So here's our first response from Clinton: draw the attention of the board of directors to implement the recommendations. Maybe Clinton, perhaps you could open your mic and tell us a little bit more about why you want to do that.
All right, so I think the owners of the actuarial evaluation reports in the first place is the board of directors, and usually supervisor may intervene one way or the other where you feel the recommendations there are quite stringent, that you really need to put in some measures. But on the first glance, you want the board of directors to factor in whatever recommendations that they had from the actuary in making any policies or any changes in the way they run the business as a whole, since they are the ultimate owners of or they have the legal responsibility of financial returns. Yeah.
So if I put that another way, you're saying that the recommendation is made to the company, to the board, and so you would like to be informed about what they were doing about it. You might want to, you know, so you're interested to know. That would be how I would describe it. Presumably the board doesn't necessarily take every recommendation.
Yeah, so yeah, that's right. And then I mean, from a supervisor point of view as well, if an actuary made some recommendations, probably based on the stress or scenario testing, and you know that, oh, if they default to maybe the largest counterparties, they could near insolvency and all that, you like to monitor such arrangements. you may like to investigate further. You may like to recommend to them that they will have to diversify the amount of investment held. So with the supervisor, you have a whole lot to do. But my point is, first of all, leave it for the owners of the AVR. You are the supervisor, obviously. You have the final say in the operations of the insurer, one way or the other, because you can revoke their license if you feel they are insolvent, no matter how out the board of directors may be. But yeah, it gives you a whole lot of details on what to do and what not to do.
Yes, so that reminds me also, if we just jump back to this slide, reminds me also of this this area of, you know, what the role of the actuary is, because I think one of the things that you're doing when you raise the recommendations made by the actuary with the board is, and you know, even if you're just saying, you know, these recommendations were made, can you tell us what the situation is in terms of addressing them? That's a fairly sort of low-key request in a way. It's just a sort of general conversation, but it does say to the company, you take the actuary seriously. The actuary's role is important as part of the supervisory approach that you're doing. And if they don't take the actuary seriously, you can't really rely on that here. You would have to go back to a more controlled approach to that company. So this model on this slide does pick up on that, I think. We have another comment from Louise. Would check to see if the recommendation is practical and in line with regulatory requirements. So that's an interesting comment too there, Louise. I think, would you like to say a little more about that?
Okay, good morning, everyone. As a regulator, I would be looking to see that the company is complying with the requirements. So if the actuary makes a recommendation, I would see if it's in line with what we have to do and what we have to check for. And based on that, we would investigate further and to see whether the recommendation is suitable to be implemented and give any further advice on that. Thank you.
Right. So, I mean, this is a sort of another step, not, and you know, so some people can have the process where they say, look, as I'm going through this report, I'm just going to write down everywhere that the actuary says recommend, and I'm going to follow up with the company what they think of the recommendation. Now, as I said, maybe the company will come back and say, that recommendation he's been making for the last 5 years, we don't think it's worth doing, so we're not doing it. And then you have to make a judgment about whether you're going to say, well, we disagree. And so it sounds like, Louise, you're going to apply a filter to the recommendations and work out which ones you want to express particular interest in with a company and which ones you're less interested in. And that could be the case. If the actuary says, well, look, I recommend this, but it doesn't really matter too much, it's just a nice thing to do, then, you know, you saying to the company, you know, we demand that you implement this recommendation is kind of seems a bit like you didn't really understand. So one thing that you can do to get more of that feedback is to actually discuss the recommendations with the actuary first to get a little bit more background and perspective. And again, you don't need to fully understand the recommendations to do that. You can always just ask the actuary about these recommendations. And after a few years, if they repeating this recommendation and they're not doing anything about it, does that concern you? And see what they say. I have seen situations where actuaries did make a recommendation repeatedly, and it was to do with the quality of the data that they were getting. And when we discussed it with the actuary and how they were, it wasn't really seemingly improving. They said, well, it was actually improving, but it just wasn't improving such that they could stop making the recommendation. But generally, they thought professionally they had to make it, but they told us, well, the company is working on it. You know, I'm actually satisfied with progress. So then we thought, okay, we don't need to raise that. Well, that's good. Now, we've got about 4 minutes for maybe one more, and perhaps people can type into the chat on this one. This is a more challenging one. So I'm going to tell you my answer to number 3. What would be an example of a situation where you thought an appointed actuary might cease to be fit and proper? So, you know, in a lot of jurisdictions, you have to approve who the actuary is going to be, or the company makes a nomination and you have to accept it or not object or something like that. So that might have been something that you've done and you're happy and the actuary's work's going on for a while, and then something comes to your attention subsequently. Maybe the quality of the actuary's work deteriorates. Maybe the actuary is a consultant and starts doing work for so many different companies that they don't have much time to spend on this one. Maybe they do something that means they fall foul of your rules, like they become personally bankrupt or they get arrested for some crime, maybe a non-financial crime. Actuaries are not all uniformly saints. Some of them have actually ended up in difficult situations under the criminal law. So it's unusual, but you know, I pay attention when those things happen because it's very interesting usually. So the question is, you've now got a view that perhaps the company should do something. The question is, what would you do about it? What would be your supervisory action if you formed the opinion that the actuary was no longer fit and proper? Let's see who's the fastest person at typing. The fastest way to type, of course, is to use less words.
Better yet to say them.
Yes, well, that's true. Yes, you don't have to type if you just open the microphone and say, "This is what I do." Who wants to put their hand up? Clinton is a fast typer. Ah, now Chesney, there's a new comment. Revoke the appointment. Could you just turn on your mic and tell us, is that something you can do in your jurisdiction? You have the power to do that?
Hi, Craig. Yes, actually, we do, because when we appoint these people who are in key positions, we do make a disclaimer to say if something comes up that makes us to start believe that you're no longer fit and proper, we can revoke your appointment. So the Act does empower us to do that.
I have had conversations with some jurisdictions where they felt that they had the power to approve people, but they didn't have a power to disapprove them. And other people thought, well, we do because it's kind of implied. We can withdraw our approval. So different people might have different views depending on their legal system exactly about that. But I mean, as we've saw from my examples, people do become, you know, it's not guaranteed the person who's fit and proper on day one stays that way. And Clinton, you would make the request to the company to change the actuary. So that's why. Perhaps you could say a little bit about why you would do that.
Okay, so I quickly went to grab the Insurance Act in Ghana. I wanted to know if we had made that provision, but I realized it's just, as you were saying, appointment of appointed actuary, approval and the notice to the commission, and that was just about it. There was nothing like revocation, as he said. But I think it's implicit, because if I have the say to approve who your actuary is going to be, in the same line, I should be able to tell you that he's no longer fit and proper, and you have to change the person. But I'll leave that for the legal people.
There is there's a sort of supervisory philosophy point to this, though, as well, and that kind of goes back to that risk-based reliance on people and good corporate governance and processes. You know, because there's a whole lot of other people at the company who have to be fit and proper as well. I mean, there are ones that you might have to approve, but there'll be other ones that just have to be competent and capable, including the chief executive, and the board has to be competent and capable as a group. And so presumably, let's imagine the case where the actuary is arrested for murder. As I say, that's a pretty extreme case. I've known one or two. That would raise a question about what the company thinks about what it should do about that, and presumably whether they feel the actuary can continue to act in this responsible way even while they're going through that process. And so if the company says, look, we don't think we should do anything about this, it's up to you, then that's a different story, because you have to think to yourself, well, is the chief executive competent? What if they didn't even know about this until I told them? You know, perhaps their corporate governance system that I'm relying on isn't very reliable after all. We have a hand up, and that is with Elias.
Yeah,
How are you, my friend? You'd like to make an observation?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I think this is just a very interesting conversation, because if you look at the evolution of, I would say the regulatory standards and even the regulations that are currently being developed. If you look at the main piece of legislation, which is the Insurance Act, it kind of provides an overview of the appointment and really the approval of key control functions. But what we've observed over time is that many regulations that are currently being developed are currently looking into what we call a continuous assessment on the fit and propriety of this particular key person. So for instance, if you look at, for instance, Kenya, each and every year, the company has to do what we call a fit and proper assessment to its key staff, and that has to also be shared with the regulator. And within that particular process, it is clear that the company need to ensure that in case any of its members do not meet that fit and propriety criteria, they need to either withdraw that particular person from holding such a position and basically get to appoint another person in that particular position that again will go through the same approval process. So ideally what needs to happen is that I think the jurisdictions might need to look at their fit and propriety assessment processes, which needs to be continuous, because you wouldn't want this particular process to happen at a point in time. That might not be might not be risk-based in any nature, and what really requires to happen, given that there is a compliance function within an insurance company, that particular function has to continuously check the fit and propriety of the company staff, and in case there's any position that might not, I would say a standard has not been met, then the regulation requires that they need to make note to the regulator within 7 days that there's a person that might not be fit and proper, and the regulator must make a determination on such a particular case. So importantly, the way the Act was formulated in the past kind of provides an avenue of appointing and approving such particular persons. But over time, there's an evolution on the fit and propriety requirements, particularly governance requirements, for the purposes of enabling a clear avenue of or checking whether these people meet all the required criteria. Over time, also what we've noticed is that previously you could see that the rotation would be required on audit function, whereby the audit firm would work for a particular period, and after that there was need to change the auditor and then maybe they would come back after a period of time just to ensure that the familiarity kind of reduces. That is something that also we've seen within the the appointed actuaries, and the reason is this: as you get familiarity, also we know the actuaries have an actuarial code of conduct, but the regulators also feel like they need to ensure that there is no familiarity, and there is need also to rotate appointed actuaries over time, whereby an appointed actuary might work in a particular company for a period of time, then after that the company has to appoint another actuary and for another period of time, just to ensure that again there's no familiarity. So there's a lot of evolution in terms of the regulations, just trying to strengthen these key, I would say, key control functions, and also these kind of independent roles that are currently being that basically companies are required to have within their companies.
Yeah, so I think that, and also the useful contributions also from in the chat. I see Chesney as well noted the importance of the board's role. I mean, Elias made the point that the compliance function needs to be working, and if as a supervisor you might say, look, we can intervene to deal with the actuary, or we can say we want the company to intervene to deal with the actuary. But maybe what we're really interested in from our supervisory point of view is, why did the compliance regime not work to fix this problem before we even had to raise it? So these are sort of spectrums down the line as we move down this risk-based approach, as we take the steak away from the tomato. I see Janice has her hand up, and I also know that my time has probably expired, I think, Jeff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Janice so she can make her comment, but also perhaps, Janice, you can continue on with the next part of the program.
Yes, thanks, Craig. Let me not talk too much then if we've got a lot going on. But just to bear in mind that also you might find that the Actuarial Society in your country has got quite a lot of rules around who can act in certain positions. So in South Africa, you can't calculate the insurance liabilities for a life insurer if you don't have a practicing certificate, which requires a certain amount of experience. So you can also, I think, liaise quite with the actuarial profession in your country to find out how they can also help you to set the bar correctly for people to have the right integrity and the right experience to do the job. And the actuarial professional body will also intervene if somebody's behavior is not fit and proper. So I think it's good to work together. Great. Okay, so thank you for everybody who submitted action plans. We've had quite a few in the last few days, and it's really good to see how people really want to take what they've learned and share it with their colleagues, and also to change some of the processes that you have in your supervisor to really look at actuarial aspects in a little bit more detail. So what we're going to do now is just have a quick reminder of what needs to be considered for your action plan. And then we have got quite a few problem statements and objectives that we'll have a look at and how we can improve on some of those statements. And then finally, we'll just have a look at some of the steps in developing your action plan. So we don't have a lot of time, but I want to just give you some, take some time now to give you some input so that if you want to make changes to your action plan between today and tomorrow, that you can make some changes and you can get some more input on action plans tomorrow. So just a quick reminder is your action plan needs to cover a problem statement, the objectives, and the action plan steps. And I think that we thought about some questions yesterday to really help you think about the types, how to word your problem statements and how to word your objectives, and how to think about what would be practical to implement in your supervisor. And these were some of the questions that we thought of. So think to yourself when you're looking at your problem statement and your objectives, or when you're writing them up this evening, why is this a problem? So here you can almost take a risk-based approach. Is this a very serious problem in your jurisdiction, or is it only a minor problem? And then have a look in terms of your objective of what you want to achieve. Is this going to make you a better supervisor? Is it going to help you to do your job better? Or maybe your colleagues to do their jobs better? And then another thing that's very important is there must be some sort of end to this action plan and to implementing this action plan. So how are you going to know when you've achieved those objectives? So they need to be specific enough for you to be able to know, okay, our supervisors achieved these objectives, now we can move on to something else. And then we need to be very careful that we're being realistic. So what can be achieved in maybe a 1-year time frame? And then our action plan steps, we need to break down all of the steps that we need to take to achieve these goals or achieve these objectives into very small steps. We need to be quite specific about who's going to be responsible. So we need to talk about maybe which department at the supervisor will be responsible. We need to be realistic about the time involved. So it can take a long time to collect data from industry or to analyze information. And we need to think about the availability of resources. So you all have other jobs that you are working on all the time. So what is realistic in terms of all of your other responsibilities at the supervisor? So these are quite small, but we have 7 examples of problem statements, and most of them have objectives. So I've labeled them 1 to 5. Most of these, the problem statements 1, there are 3 problem statements 1. They're all looking at areas of a lack of understanding of actuarial skills and a lack of being able to interpret actuarial reports or valuation reports. So ARVs are our actuarial valuation reports. So our first statement, if we look at the light green one, so the problem statement is that there's a lack of internal and interdepartmental training on actuarial concepts, and the objective is to ensure that there is training. So this this area recognizes, so here we really would want to understand, why is it a problem that we don't have training on actuarial concepts at the regulator? So here's where it would be good to ask that question of why is this a problem? And then the second question, the objective is really around, and how will this make the team that you're working with perform their duties more effectively? So this is quite a broad statement, so it maybe can be refined a bit by thinking about some of the issues around why this is a problem and how this will and what needs to be addressed in terms of the challenges that you're facing. And the same with this objective, that this is also quite a broad objective, to talking about implementing training. Maybe we want to be a little bit more specific now that you've done the whole, nearly, you have finished the course virtually. Maybe there's some aspects that you really want to focus on in terms of those actuarial aspects. So I don't think it's necessary for everybody at the supervisor to maybe become actuaries. So we need to be able to focus very carefully on what aspects non-actuaries should be focusing on or learning more about in that area. So that was quite, so these questions are just need a little bit of work in terms of where do you want to end up at the end of the approach. Then we had another question, 2 areas of the orange and the dark blue, is really framing the problem as not having the skills and the knowledge to analyze the actuarial valuation reports. And the dark blue one goes a step forward to say that they're missing having a more comprehensive analysis. So because we're lacking understanding, this is a challenge, and this is something that's missing in the assessment of the actuarial valuations. So here we've identified a key problem, and here maybe again we can think a little bit more further in terms of what are the consequences of not having that comprehensive analysis. So you don't necessarily need to put all of that detail in the problem statement, but for yourselves in your own notes, think about what these consequences might be. So maybe you don't pick up challenges where the reserves are too low early enough. Maybe you don't pick up challenges where the assumptions are inappropriate. So there's some implications to this lack of understanding that would be quite useful to understand. And those implications will help you to then set out your objectives. So if you think about what will go wrong because we don't have a good understanding of the actuarial reports, then that really can help you to set your objectives. So here is a helpful objective that looks at reviewing the reports as well as asking the right questions. So this is having a look at 2 aspects of the supervision process that you're going to look at. And maybe, again, now that you've done the course, maybe you can have a look at the different aspects of the report and then possibly identify which aspects of the report you would like to work on the most. And here again, it's really an objective to look at those actuarial reports. Craig, I don't know if you've got any comments on the problem statements that were all relating to understanding actuarial concepts and actuarial reports.
I just make, from an action planning point of view, I think the comment you made previously as well on the previous slide about, knowing when you get to the completion of your action plan, some of these problem statements are sort of a bit clearer to me than others. So if I just pick, for example, being able to ask the right questions, well, I mean, I think that's kind of a bit of an endless quest. Let's say, you know, if I could ask all the right questions all the time, that would be wonderful. So maybe when I get to the end of my my action plan, I want to be able to ask, you know, maybe some things that are. I think your suggestion be a bit more focused is a good idea to narrow down just, you know, what we want to do. Maybe we want to be able to ask some questions, because I know sometimes people have that challenge of, if I don't think I have all the right questions, I don't ask any. That's sort of another alternative, but giving it a little bit more focus like that could be good. Just, you know, what do you reasonably think you'll have at the end? And just while I have the microphone, so I'm not using too much time coming back to me again, I'll just make, I think a good example of this might be perhaps the number 2 on the intervention guideline being developed. See, I know when I get to the end of that project, because someone will be able to hold up the intervention guideline and say, look, here it is, you know, tick, done. So when you think about your objectives for the other ones, see if you can think about something where you can say, okay, it's going to be blindingly obvious when we get to the end of it that something will be there that wasn't there now, and let's describe what that is.
Thanks, Craig. Dunya?
Yeah, coming back to the endless quest of asking the right questions, could a template with multiple possible questions be part of the objective for this one? Just a thought.
Thanks, Dunya. So I think that both from Craig and Dunya's comments, you want something tangible at the end that you can measure. So you want to be able to either see that guideline, or see that template, or say I've had the following departments attend a training program that covers the following aspects, and so on. And yes, so I also agreed with Craig. So example 2 of the problem statements and the objective is much more concrete, and helps you also to define the steps that you're going to take for your action plan a lot more clearly, because at least you have the end goal. You know where you're starting, and it will help you much better to have a look at the steps. So here the problem was that there isn't a guideline on the intermediate interventions that need to be taken based on insurer's risk profile. And this is what Elias was talking about earlier, that you need to have that ladder of intervention to say, when this goes wrong, we're going to do this. If something more serious goes wrong, we're going to do something more serious. So here the aim, the objective is to develop that guideline. And then it has a goal of what you want to achieve and how it will make you a better supervisor in terms of being able to take prompt action when there are challenges. So here you can even see how this intervention is going to help you to do your job better. Okay, Elias.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe just to also weigh in, one of the things that I've learned over time, particularly working in a regulatory environment for the last 10 years, is that most of the time, when a regulator is faced with a situation that they need to make a decision, most of the time they are clouded with so many things that they could, or so many routes that they could take to maybe arrest a particular situation, or maybe to kind of direct a company to do some particular things, and that could take time. At the same way, you would find that a decision that is basically being made might not be the most effective And again, if you take time and think through what types of decision you take, also makes your decision not be prompt and proactive. So I think it will be also interesting to see, based on the experience that different supervisors have, what would be the typical strategic or supervisory actions that they could list, and then from there, how would those actions and where would they basically kind of enforce those particular actions based on different scenarios that they have been facing. So I think it will be important also to see what typical actions and what stage would they really apply those particular actions, because there's always a delay on what actions our supervisor needs to take, not because those actions are not there, but because they are quite a variety, and you might even end up using a particular action that might not really be the best on its application to a particular case. So I think there's also need to maybe review different pieces of legislation, different regulations, and see which would fit with which types of cases, particularly on what we've gone through during this particular few weeks of study on issues of risk-based and other components.
Thanks, Elias. So I think for the country that's looking at the dark green objectives and problem statement, it will be good to think about the practicality of those guidelines. But please, so what Elias has been talking about a bit is what some of the forum questions are for the monitoring of solvency for risk-based supervision. So please, for the people who have contributed, thanks very much, but please have a look at other people's contributions. And if you haven't contributed yet, I think it's quite a nice database on different types of things that can go wrong and interventions that can be used. So then maybe just the last thing I'm going to say on this slide is for the light green, the purple and the turquoise, all of these questions came from the same action plan. So we really want to, these are all valid and useful and things that need to be addressed. I think it will be helpful to maybe pick which is the most important of these three areas and to work on that in a little bit more detail. Okay, Clinton.
Yeah, so what happened is in Ghana, we were advised that if we could come up with a single action plan. So we actually met last week to deliberate on the possible problem statement and the objectives. So how is this going to work? Or because I realized with the submission, it had to be individual.
So I think for Ghana, maybe you can chat to your colleagues and see which of the three problem statements and objectives you really want to work on, because it'll be easier if there's a team, a group of people at your supervisor who can work together to try and get some of these things implemented. It'll be quite difficult, I think, if you're working on your own. Will that make sense to you, Clinton? Yeah, so I think it'll be easier if you work together, and maybe you can save the other 2 points for a later time. And then just lastly, I wanted to just remind you, so we haven't talked about the steps in your action plan, but there's some common pitfalls that we've seen in previous action plans and in some of these action plans that have already been handed in. So maybe you can have a look at these as well. So sometimes we've talked quite a lot about this. It's unclear how these objectives will be achieved through the action plan steps. So we don't necessarily know how you're going to share the knowledge with your colleagues. So we need to be very precise and make sure that we are quite clear on how these steps will be achieved. Sometimes we're missing steps. So there's an example where one of the supervisors wants to have peer training, but you would need to identify which supervisors you would like to engage with first. And then sometimes there's some areas where there's more than one activity that's happening in the same step. So try and break down your action steps into small steps, and that you'll be able to then measure, have I achieved this step? Can I go on to the next one? And then in terms of the timing, so sometimes our timing, I know everything seems urgent, so there are many places where the timing is as soon as possible, but sometimes that never happens. So maybe you want to say by the end of the year, or within 3 months, something like that. And then there are other places where maybe the people who are, yes, and then be realistic. So, I mean, you're not necessarily going to be able to start the project next week because you need to do some planning ahead of time. So, so think about all of these areas. Sometimes the responsibilities are a little bit vague. So we just list things as it's the industry or the supervisor. We probably need to know which departments we're working with. Is it the life insurance market? Is the long-term insurance market? And then we need to consider all stakeholders. So most of the time we're just considering what the industry and the supervisor are doing, but think about, and this will help you to determine how this is going to make you a better supervisor. Think about what the impact to policyholders might be, or to your consumers, and then think about whether you will need to, which departments need to be engaged with, if you need to get external consultants to do training, and then maybe also who you can engage with to help you achieve your goals. So those are just a few tips on how to maybe improve on your action plans and make them more practical and more precise. It'll be great if you had a look at them again before Thursday, that's tomorrow. And there's a lot more time tomorrow to give input into the steps and the problem statements. So please have everything as almost final as it can be, so that you can get the most out of tomorrow's session. Dunya?
Yes, I just had a thought, particularly for those objectives where transfer of knowledge is highlighted, so some sort of transfer of knowledge, either from this training or future trainings. It will be also useful to think about sustainability, or, you know, institutionalizing that knowledge. I don't know, some ideas are perhaps creating a database of that knowledge, or I don't know, recordings of some type of certain trainings. So so in whatever you do in that sense, just think about, you know, future colleagues, new colleagues who come in, and that they don't have to go through that not everyone has to go through the same thing, but that resources are made available within the institution.
Okay, so maybe there isn't really time for questions, but if maybe there's a couple, we can take a couple of minutes just for something that's worrying you, that you want to ask about before you work on your action plan for tomorrow. I know it's tea time. Maybe for some people it's lunchtime. Okay, great. So, yeah, but so for the people who have submitted, you can still update some parts. And then for the people who are still working on their action plans, you've got a couple of tips now on some of the things to focus on. So bear in mind, we only need one action plan per country. Is that right, Janine? Yes. And bear in mind that you'll probably have to work together on something. So at least you've got somebody who can help you at your jurisdiction. Okay. So thanks very much and good luck for tomorrow. We're expecting fantastic plans.
So as a reminder, we'll see the action plans in the second session tomorrow after the break. So thank you. I think this is good feedback. The first session tomorrow, we'll be looking at the case study on developing capabilities where we have a hypothetical regulatory regime that has some issues. Has room for improvement, and we look at 3 insurers operating within that regime. And we'll have some familiar faces back to help lead the discussion. Eamon and Fred will be back with us. And that's all from me. Yanina, what else?
No, I think that's all. So just a big thank you to Craig for the session, and Janice again for going through these action plan examples, and well, everyone for your contributions. And we look forward to, well, I guess our last live session tomorrow. So have a great rest of the day and see you tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.
And there'll be surprises tomorrow too.
Right.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.